Meantime, Mr. Secretary, I know you have to go in a moment, but let me pursue one point. It seems that in this discussion that's taken place between you and the committee, and this debate which has taken place in the nation, that we are comparing apples and oranges sometimes. And I notice you and the administration have been very careful when referring to democratic forces in China of talking about democratic forces within the government. Whereas when we talked about democratic forces in Eastern Europe, we almost always were talking about democratic forces that were outside of the statist regimes, outside of the government. And will you discuss with me just for a moment the similarities or lack of similarities between the circumstances and the urgings for change that took place in Eastern Europe, or are taking place, and those that you think exist in China? I met with a group of leading Chinese Americans who, to my surprise, I must tell you, were split on whether or not it was the day after, the day of the veto vote, override vote. And there was a minority, but a distinct minority, who shared the view of the administration. And I was quite frankly surprised by that. And they offered the following rationale, and let me repeat it to you and for you to comment on this entire point that I'm trying to make. They said that there's a fundamental difference between the urgings for democracy that exist in a relatively well-educated, industrialized Eastern Europe, where in the GDR and in Czechoslovakia and even in Poland, not even, but in Poland, and the literacy rate is high, where the rate of accomplishment relative to modern skills that would be useful in a market economy are high, and where there have been nascent elements of change that have been, whether it's Charter 77 or Dubček in Czechoslovakia or in Poland in years past and Hungary in '56, and they go back, where there have been those elements outside the government that have been nurtured, repressed, given some leeway, sometimes not, that have finally come to fruition. Whereas in China, an incredibly large peasant population that on balance probably still believes itself better off than it was prior to Mao and does not possess the same kind of urgings and inklings that were possessed in Eastern Europe. And it takes me back, and I will conclude with this, to your apparent thoughtful distinction, not accidental distinction, about democratic forces within the government. Can you comment on that?
Yes, sir. And to a degree what you've described, I would associate myself with, but with some qualifications, I think. And again, I have to be careful how I say this in an open session for not this audience, but other audiences. But first of all, I think it is important to understand, and I come back to my point, that what we are trying to do with regard to China is China-specific. It relates to the particular country and its the ramifications because it is a specific country. Now, we may be wrong in our analysis about it, but I would say that it is different than the way you deal with the GDR or Romania or Czechoslovakia, because it's a different country, not least of which is it's substantially over 1 billion people and is a good bit larger geographically. Also, China has a long history of what I would best describe as warlordism. It has a long history of fragmentation. The people in Chongqing are not by any means the same as the people who live in Shanghai. The differences in the country are monumental. It is a fact, I think, fairly well demonstrable in history, that the process of reform in China so far has been largely led from the top, from a group within the leadership of the Chinese party and of the government, which has believed that modernization was essential to the long-term future of China. And certainly you have to put, in terms of historical perspective at least, Deng Xiaoping in that group. The changes that have taken place in China, that took place over the course of the last several decades, in large part, I think because of the relationship with the United States, have created, in fact, the very things we saw take place in Tiananmen Square, the yearning for freedom, the students feeling the way they do about changes in the People's Republic of China. I would not deny for a moment that the relationship with us has led to a good bit of that, which has led certain of the Chinese leadership to say that those kinds of relations therefore must stop because it is corrupting the Chinese society. I am not for a moment saying that there isn't a broad-based yearning for a more free political and economic system in China. I think there is, and Tiananmen Square showed that. I think in part the fact that that exists is because of the reforms and changes that were made over the course of the decade or so preceding Tiananmen Square. I think it is probably true that in the Chinese case, at least at this time in history, if there are to be changes which bring China back toward the kind of society we in this country all want, they will depend to a large measure for some time to come on the attitudes and activities of people within the leadership. And there are those within the leadership who don't want for 1 minute to see China proceed down that course. That is why I say isolation from our point of view is such a dangerous perspective. I would also argue that you can make the case in the East European situation that where we had a choice between dealing with someone in a government or a party who was for a liberalizing process, as against the hardliner who wanted nothing to change, that our ability to influence those people over time, over the course of the last 40 years, has in part been responsible for what we now see in Eastern Europe. I don't want to carry that too far, because what's clear in Eastern Europe is that the system never took root in any of those countries. And what has surprised us all is the rapidity with which it has collapsed, which demonstrates that it never took root. Having said that, I think a Dubček did make a difference in Czechoslovakia. He did provide a tradition which the people today, the Husaks and so forth, the present president of Czechoslovakia can refer back to and have some relationship to. I do think it's made a difference there, but I think the Chinese case is fundamentally a different kind of a situation right now.
Well, quite frankly, not that it particularly matters, in my view, but quite frankly, that's the only remotely sound explanation for your policy that I can find.
Took a long time to get there, so.
No, I mean that sincerely. I disagree with it, but it's the only intellectually sound basis from which you can, in my view, justify the policy you have undertaken. Because if, in fact, the students you believed were as they were once the heavy hand of the Soviet Union was lifted, and each of those statist regimes in Eastern Europe was told, you're on your own, baby, it was only a matter of time, days, and months before Hanukkah fell in that most repressive of East German regimes. Because when those students marched, they did not represent students. They represented the heart and soul and blood of all East Germans, or almost all East Germans. And so if one believed that the students in Tiananmen Square, in fact, communicated that same intensity throughout the population of China, then obviously one would be convinced that you should not do anything other than try to spur that and move it. And I don't think you've done anything, quite bluntly, but dampen that, if not help crush it. But it only makes sense from a foreign policy standpoint. I'm just trying to understand what motivated you all, because I know you're all decent, honorable, bright people. And on the surface, what you say makes no sense to me. but it makes sense to me only in the context of concluding that it must come from the top down rather than what happened once the lid was taken off. What you knew and you schooled me on when I visited you in Yugoslavia 10 years ago, when you were ever long ago, 11, 12 years ago, when you were ambassador. You told me what was underneath the surface in Yugoslavia, even though I'm not comparing Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia in the same context in the relationship with the Soviet Union. But at any rate, having said that, I still strongly disagree, and I would argue that the only reason the Chinese leadership did what it did, which is very little, is because of world approbation. No other reason. And then when they finally made the change they made, it seems to me some of it would have occurred no matter what happened. Sum it up and conclude from my perspective, and you can make any closing comment you want. The changes, the concessions and gestures, a release of 573 demonstrators. It obviously ignores the fact that thousands more remain, not ignores, but does not account for the fact thousands more remain in detention. And readmission of the Voice of America reporter ignores the fact that the Chinese still jam the Voice of America transmissions. Chinese pledge on missile transfers, that's an old promise, and makes no mention of the transfer of technology. Martial law ended, ignores the fact that many troops remain all around Beijing and that the opposition activities remain suppressed. And lastly, the concession on Cambodia, that is that enhanced role for the United Nations. That's not much of a concession, as China has long sought the UN role in the settlement of the Cambodian question since its ally, the murderous Khmer Rouge, have membership in the United Nations.